Right now, 4 human beings are sealed inside a spacecraft no bigger than a small family car, racing through space toward the moon at 24,500 miles per hour. They are farther from Earth than any living person has ever been. The toilet failed on the first day. Communications dropped less than an hour after launch. A cabin leak warning flashed just minutes before the burn that made the mission irreversible. And bolted to the bottom of their spacecraft is a heat shield that came back damaged the last time it flew. Some of NASA's own engineers argued the risk was too high. The agency went anyway. The lunar gateway has been cut loose. The next mission will not land on the moon. China is closing in. And one of the astronauts, a single father of 2 teenage daughters, told his children where to find his will before he climbed aboard. This is the story of Artemis II, the most dangerous crewed lunar mission in more than half a century. And unlike so many stories about space, this one is not locked safely in the past. It is happening now. Tonight, we are going somewhere no human being has been in 53 years. As you settle in, 4 astronauts are moving through the dark between Earth and the moon inside a machine designed to keep them alive in the least forgiving place human beings have ever tried to go. Over the next few hours, we are going to follow them from launch to lunar flyby to the moment that may determine the future of human deep space flight. We will be there when mission control loses contact. We will be there when the toilet jams. We will stand beside the engineers who studied Orion's heat shield after the last mission and came away uneasy. We will meet the 4 people inside the capsule, a widowed commander, a fighter pilot who listens to Whitey on the moon before launch, a woman who kept a poster of Earthrise on her wall as a child, and a Canadian rookie whose first trip to space is not to low Earth orbit, but all the way around the moon. We will follow the rocket, we will follow the politics, we will follow the money, and in the end, we will ask the question that hangs underneath all of it. Is any of this worth the risk? We have problems, and we are going anyway. April 1st, 2026. Kennedy Space Center, Florida. At 6:35 in the evening Eastern Time, the countdown reaches 0. A few seconds later, the ground begins to shake. Then the sky splits open. 8.8 million pounds of thrust lift the most powerful rocket ever to carry human beings away from Earth. The Space Launch System rises from Launch Complex 39B, the same pad that sent Apollo astronauts toward the moon, the same pad that launched generations of shuttles, the same ground where triumph and tragedy have stood disturbingly close together. Inside Orion, the 4 astronauts are pressed back into their seats by the violence of launch. Commander Reid Wiseman, pilot Victor Glover, mission specialist Christina Koch, mission specialist Jeremy Hansen. The rocket beneath them stands 322 feet tall. It burns through more than 725,000 gallons of supercooled propellant. Each launch costs billions. Every stage separation, every engine start, every communication handoff has been rehearsed over and over. On paper, the machine is ready. For the first few minutes, it performs exactly as it should. The solid rocket boosters burn bright and hard, then separate. The core stage shuts down. The upper stage pushes Orion into orbit. The spacecraft unfolds its solar arrays. The capsule named Integrity by its crew is flying. For a moment, it feels like one of those rare modern launches where the story goes according to plan. Then, less than an hour after liftoff, mission control loses contact. The spacecraft goes quiet, no telemetry, no voice. No usable data. Houston can still talk to Orion, but Orion cannot answer back. And for a mission like this, that kind of silence is never casual. A few dropped seconds in low Earth orbit are one thing. A communications blackout on the first crewed lunar mission in generations is another entirely. In Houston, the meaning of the moment changes with every passing second. The words are still calm. The procedures are still orderly. Controllers still speak in the measured tone that professional spaceflight demands. But underneath that calm, there is something older and more primitive: fear. Because for those minutes, nobody on Earth can say with certainty what is happening inside that spacecraft. Nobody can tell whether the crew is safe, whether the systems are healthy, whether the mission has already been compromised before it has even truly begun. Later, NASA explains it as a communications handover glitch. The vehicle itself, they say, remained healthy. The crew was fine. The mission was never actually in danger. The signal was restored. The problem was procedural, not catastrophic. That explanation may be correct. But the emotional fact remains the same. Less than an hour into Artemis II, the world got its first reminder that this mission would not be clean, not simple, and not easy. Then the toilet broke. That sounds funny, and in one sense it is. There is something almost absurdly human about hearing that one of the earliest major problems on a mission to the moon involved a clogged bathroom. But the deeper you think about it, the less funny it becomes. Inside Orion, there is only one toilet for 4 people on a 10-day mission. NASA's official name for it is the Universal Waste Management System. It cost tens of millions of dollars to design and develop. It was supposed to be a major step beyond the humiliating and improvised waste systems of the Apollo era. Apollo astronauts had no true toilet. They used bags. They had to negotiate some of the most basic bodily routines through methods that ranged from awkward to miserable. Artemis II was supposed to belong to a more advanced age. More money, more technology, more refinement, more human dignity. Instead, when the crew powers up the system, a fault light appears. The toilet is jammed. If you are at home, that is a maintenance problem. If you are inside a deep space spacecraft, it is something else entirely. Because a toilet on a long mission is not a convenience. It is not a luxury. It is infrastructure. The entire cabin is closed, shared, and finite. Waste management is part of survival. If the system cannot be restored, then every hour aboard becomes more complicated, more stressful, more unsanitary, and more psychologically difficult. Mission Control begins troubleshooting with the crew. Hours pass. Christina Koch uses a contingency device while engineers on the ground work through the issue. Eventually, the system is restored, and NASA later says the fault was tied to a controller problem, not a deeper mechanical collapse. The mission continues, but again, the tone has shifted. First communications, then the toilet. This is no longer a polished poster of 21st century exploration. This is real spaceflight, with all of its discomfort, all of its absurdity, and all of its reminders that the most expensive machine in the room can still be tripped up by something humiliatingly ordinary. Then comes the alarm that gets everyone's attention for real. About 24 hours after launch, the crew prepares for the translunar injection burn. This is the moment that will commit them to the moon. Up to now, despite all the symbolism, they are still essentially operating within a recoverable Earth orbit framework. Once the engine fires, that changes. The moon's gravity will begin to shape the mission in a way that no pilot, no matter how brilliant, can casually undo. Then, just before the burn, a cabin leak warning flashes. There are few alarms in space more terrifying than that. A pressure leak is not like a toilet fault. It is not a software issue or an inconvenience. It strikes at the first principle of life in space. You need the cabin to remain a cabin. You need the air to remain inside. Jeremy Hansen later admits that the warning got the crew's full attention immediately. In that moment, nobody is thinking about headlines or historical firsts. They are calculating, If the warning is real, what are the options? Abort, return, how much pressure are they losing? How long do they have? Can they still make the burn? Should they? Mission control moves quickly. The answer comes back, false indication, no actual leak, no depressurization, no immediate danger. But again, that answer arrives only after the crew has lived through the few hardest minutes imaginable for that stage of the mission. Then there are more annoyances. A water dispenser issue forces precautions. Software glitches appear. At one point, Commander Wiseman radios Houston to say that he seems to have two Microsoft Outlook windows open and neither of them is working. It is such a perfectly absurd detail that it almost belongs in fiction. A $23 billion lunar spacecraft, a mission carrying human beings farther from Earth than anyone alive has ever gone, and one of the problems on board is Outlook. Houston remotely fixes it, and somehow that small detail is comforting, because it reminds us that inside all the patriotic language, all the engineering achievement, all the historical grandeur, there are still just four people inside a cramped cabin trying to make systems behave. The communications drop out, the broken toilet, the false leak alarm, the water issue, the email problem, all of it adds up to one message. This mission is not smooth, and yet all of those problems share one important characteristic. They are fixable. There is one major problem on Artemis II that is not fixable. It is mounted to the bottom of the spacecraft. It weighs thousands of pounds, and the last time it flew, it came back damaged enough to shake confidence across the heat shield. No one can truly promise. In December of 2022, Orion returned from Artemis I, the first uncrewed test flight of the system. Publicly, the mission was celebrated as a success. The rocket launched. The spacecraft traveled to lunar distance. It came home. The broad architecture of the Artemis era seemed vindicated. Then engineers inspected the heat shield, and the mood changed. The shield on Orion is made of a material called avcoat, an ablative thermal protection system. It is designed to do something brutal and elegant at the same time. It protects the crew not by remaining untouched, but by destroying itself in a controlled way. It chars, erodes, burns away, and carries heat with it. That sacrificial process keeps the structure behind it from reaching temperatures that would kill the people inside. In that sense, a heat shield is one of the most beautiful lies in engineering. It looks like armor. It is actually a planned death. It survives by dying in a way the designers can predict. Avcoat traces its legacy back to Apollo. On paper, that sounds reassuring. Apollo returned from the moon. Apollo proved the concept. Apollo made survival at lunar re-entry speeds into something more than a theory. But Orion is not Apollo. It is heavier. Its structure is different. Its shield architecture is different. And unlike Apollo's one-piece honeycomb approach, Orion uses segmented avcoat blocks bonded to a composite structure. That detail turns out to matter. When Artemis I returned from lunar velocity, engineers found damage beyond what they had expected. Chunks of avcoat were missing. Erosion was irregular. Material loss appeared in places and ways that computer models had not predicted with enough accuracy. The shield had not simply charred and peeled gracefully. In some areas, it had suffered more violent loss. The investigation that followed identified a likely cause tied to skip re-entry. During Artemis I, Orion entered the atmosphere, skipped back out, and then re-entered again. That profile helps with targeting and trajectory control, but it also creates repeating cycles of intense heating and cooling. Engineers concluded that those cycles may have caused gases within the material to expand and contribute to cracking and spalling. In plain language, the shield behaved in ways the models did not fully capture. That is bad enough on an uncrewed test. It becomes something else when human beings are scheduled to ride behind the next one. The criticism that followed did not come only from internet commentators or aerospace cynics. Some of the most serious objections came from former astronauts, engineers, and safety-minded veterans of NASA history, people who had seen what happens when institutions talk themselves into believing they understand risk more fully than they actually do. One former astronaut and engineering leader said outright that he would not consider Artemis too safe to fly. That is not a casual sentence. This is not a man with no experience. This is someone who understands human spaceflight from inside the cockpit and inside the bureaucracy. Someone who knows what happened before Challenger, before Columbia. Someone who recognizes the warning signs of a system that may be normalizing uncertainty because the schedule has become too important. NASA's response was not to redesign the heat shield in time for Artemis II. Instead, the agency changed the mission profile. Artemis II will use a direct re-entry rather than a skip re-entry. The logic is simple. If repeated heating and cooling cycles helped cause the problem, then remove those cycles. Let the spacecraft plunge in once, continuously, and eliminate the condition that seems to have triggered the worst of the unexpected damage. On paper, it makes sense, but spaceflight history is full of things that made sense on paper. The critics were not reassured simply because a theory sounded coherent. They wanted proof, hard data, another uncrewed validation, a mission flown without people first. Something stronger than confident statements and revised thermal models. NASA chose to fly with crew anyway. That decision hangs over Artemis II like a shadow, because even the people defending the approach tend to do so in cautious language. They do not say the shield will be pristine. They do not say there is no risk. They do not even say cracking will not occur. They say the new profile addresses the cause. They say the expected behavior is within bounds. They say the risk is acceptable, but acceptable is a word with a terrible history in aerospace. Acceptable was used before Challenger. Acceptable was used before Columbia. The question is not whether the shield will be damaged. It will be. The question is whether the damage stays within margins. And no one on Earth can answer that with certainty until Orion comes back wrapped in plasma and either survives or the burn that cannot be taken back. About a day after launch, Artemis II reaches the point where symbolism gives way to commitment. The mission management team assembles for the go-no-go poll on translunar injection. In the control room, this is not theater. It is not for show. It is the final collective decision before 4 human beings leave the easy logic of Earth orbit and place themselves in the hands of deep space geometry. One by one, consoles report status. Go, 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 go for translunar injection. The engine ignites. It burns long enough to give Orion the extra speed it needs to escape Earth orbit and head outward along a free return path around the moon. Not too much, not too little, enough to commit them, but still preserve the trajectory that will let lunar gravity sling them home without requiring a powered lunar orbit insertion or landing sequence. That path is both comforting and chilling. It means that if everything else goes wrong, the crew is not automatically lost. Gravity itself will carry them around the moon and back toward Earth. But that same path also contains a darker truth. Once they make the burn, they are going whether they want to or not. No pulling over, no easy abort, no simple reversal. The geometry will do what geometry does. Commander Wiseman later describes the feeling of that moment as the crew looked at one another and realized the line had been crossed. This was no longer rehearsal, no longer a mission held close to home by orbital mechanics. that crews and engineers have lived with for decades. This was the old road, the lunar road, the road humanity has not taken in half a century. Jeremy Hansen radios a hopeful message afterward, talking about humanity, the future, and the significance of the journey. The language is ceremonial, as it always is in these moments, but underneath the polished phrasing lies something more immediate. They are leaving the Earth system as most astronauts know it. From that point on, they are becoming a different category of crew. Deep space crew, not station crew, not shuttle crew, not orbital crew. A crew that, for the next several days, will be farther from rescue than any living person has ever been. That is not poetic exaggeration. It is literal. As Orion coasts outward, the Earth begins to shrink behind them, the moon begins to grow ahead, and every hour reinforces the simple truth that the return path is already written. They are committed. The four people inside the capsule. Every major space mission is wrapped in hardware, systems, and institutions, but at the center of all of it, there are still only people. Artemis II has four. Victor Glover is the pilot, and his presence on this mission means more than a line in a press release. He is the first black person to travel beyond low Earth orbit. He is a naval aviator, a test pilot, a veteran of the International Space Station, and a man who carries history with him in a very conscious way. Before launch, he listens to two songs. One of them is Whitey on the Moon by Gil Scott-Heron, a spoken-word piece from the Apollo era that questioned the moral contrast between space triumph and inequality on Earth. It is not the sort of song most people would choose if they wanted a clean, uncomplicated mythology around lunar flight. That is exactly why Glover chooses it. He is not interested in a sterilized version of history. He understands that the same nation that builds rockets is also the nation that leaves problems unresolved on the ground. He understands symbolism. He understands contradiction. And still, he goes. That decision says more about him than almost any official biography could. Then there is Commander Reid Wiseman. He is a previous station astronaut, a naval test pilot, and the mission's leader. He is also a widower, raising two daughters after the death of his wife. Before launch, he sat down with those daughters and told them where to find his will, where to find the paperwork, what to do if he did not come home. That detail changes the entire emotional architecture of the mission. It takes lunar flight out of the realm of historical abstraction and places it back where all risk really lives, in kitchens, in bedrooms, in family conversations, in the silent spaces after children go to sleep. This is not just a commander climbing into a capsule. This is a father making sure his daughters know where the documents are. He goes anyway. Christina Koch carries a different emotional arc. As a child, she had a poster of Earthrise on her wall, the famous Apollo 8 photograph showing Earth lifting above the lunar horizon. That image shaped her imagination. It shaped her sense of what space meant. It shaped, in some quiet childhood way, the trajectory of her life. Now she is on a mission that will let her see the real thing, not a reproduction, not a print, not a framed icon of the space age. The real Earth, rising over the real moon through a window she can press her face against. She is also the first woman in history to travel to lunar distance. That too matters. It is easy to hear "first woman" and let the phrase pass because modern audiences are used to that kind of milestone language. But this one is different. For 53 years, lunar spaceflight belonged entirely to men from a narrow chapter of American history. Koch steps through that closed door and changes the shape of the story itself. Then there is Jeremy Hansen, the rookie. He is an experienced military pilot, yes. He is deeply trained, yes. But none of that changes the astonishing fact that his first trip to space is around the moon. Most astronauts first go to orbit. They learn the physical shock of launch. They learn what weightlessness feels like. They learn how their bodies respond. They learn how to live in a spacecraft with Earth still relatively close. Jeremy Hansen's first mission is not like that. His first launch is this launch. His first weightlessness is on this mission. His first real spaceflight is the most dangerous crewed lunar mission in modern history. He brings small moon-shaped pendants for his family and packs maple syrup and maple cookies because he is Canadian and some comforts are too foundational to leave behind. There is something wonderfully human in that. Maple syrup, family keepsakes, and the moon. That is spaceflight in its truest form, monumental and domestic at once. Put the four of them together, and the crew begins to feel like a novel someone would reject for being too perfectly balanced. A widowed commander, a history-aware pilot, a woman chasing the image that shaped her childhood, a Canadian first-timer headed farther from Earth than any Canadian ever has, and yet this is not fiction. These are the four people inside Integrity right now. The mission matters because of its systems. It also matters because 10 days in a space the size of a car. The Orion crew module offers about 330 cubic feet of pressurized volume. That number matters less as an engineering statistic than as a human fact. It means four adults living together, sleeping together, eating together, troubleshooting together, using one toilet together, and trying to preserve some version of grace and mental stability in a space barely large enough to feel like a room. There are only 2 windows. That matters too. The entire moon mission, the grand view, the entire emotional promise of the outward journey must be filtered through 2 openings in the wall. There is no luxury of each astronaut having a private observational station. Looking outside becomes choreography. Who gets the camera? Who gets the voice recorder? Who is documenting which feature? Who moves when? Who waits? There is almost no idle motion in a spacecraft this small. To sleep, astronauts strap themselves into bags attached to surfaces inside the cabin. There is no bed in the ordinary sense because there is no up or down. The body floats. Arms drift. Loose movement becomes chaos unless it is restrained. The sleeping system is practical, but practicality is not comfort. The cabin gets cold. Pilot Victor Glover later mentions that the crew wished they had made different sleeping bag choices. Mission Control works with them to fine-tune the environment, but those first nights are still a reminder that in space, even rest has to be engineered and negotiated. Then there is food. Meals are rehydrated, portioned, and functional. Food in space is not about pleasure first. It is about calories, water, digestion, logistics, and maintaining morale just enough to keep the human machine running. Jeremy Hansen's maple items matter more in that context than they might seem. A taste from home in deep space is not trivial. It is psychological gravity. Exercise is mandatory, not optional. Microgravity starts changing the body almost immediately. Muscles weaken. Bones begin to lose density. Fluids shift. The crew uses compact exercise hardware because 10 days in a capsule still counts as time away from the loading that human bodies evolved under. Even the act of exercising is complicated inside a spacecraft. When you push against an exercise device in zero gravity, you push against the vehicle. Nothing is isolated. Motion becomes system interaction. One astronaut works out while engineers on the ground watch not only the body, but the spacecraft's response. The toilet, once repaired, becomes the most valuable private space on board. Not because anyone loves spending time there, but because in a cabin that small, the bathroom is the only space that can feel even briefly personal. Jeremy Hansen later describes it as one of the few places where a person can feel alone for a moment. That may sound strange until you imagine 10 days with 3 other people always nearby, always floating, always talking, always present. Privacy becomes oxygen of another kind. And when something as tiny and ridiculous as Outlook stops working, it feels almost perfect. Of course, a crew headed to the moon still has to call for tech support. Of course, one of the defining images of modern spaceflight would include an astronaut talking about Microsoft software while 250,000 miles of vacuum lies ahead. That is why these small moments matter. They puncture mythology without reducing greatness. They remind us that exploration is still done by human beings, not archetypes. Inside Orion, the crew is not living inside a legend. They are living inside a machine. And machines demand maintenance, patience, compromise, and the ability to laugh when you can. The quiet violence of deep space. There is a reason human beings have not left low Earth orbit in more than 50 years, and that reason is not simply political will. Deep space itself is hostile. In low Earth orbit, astronauts still remain under the broad protection of Earth's magnetic field. The planet shields them from much of the charged particle environment that constantly moves through the solar system. The International Space Station, for all its danger, still sits inside a protective framework the moon does not offer. Artemis II leaves that framework. On the way out and on the way back, Orion passes through the Van Allen radiation belts. Those are the trapped zones of energetic particles surrounding Earth. Crossing them is manageable, but not trivial. The dose adds up. Then there is the Sun. The crew is flying during an active phase of the solar cycle. If a significant solar particle event occurs at the wrong moment, Orion does not carry some perfect miracle shield that makes the danger vanish. The crew's emergency procedure would involve building the best improvised shelter they can with the densest available materials inside the cabin and riding out the storm as best they can. That detail strips away the illusion of total control. The public often imagines modern spaceflight as a realm of complete precision, as if every danger has already been engineered into submission. But radiation reveals the limits of that belief. There are still forces in space that can only be managed, not mastered. The radiation is invisible, silent, without drama in the cinematic sense. It does not roar like launch. It does not flash like an alarm. It simply enters tissue, changes cells, and accumulates. At the same time, microgravity begins doing its own work. Fluids shift upward, faces swell. The inner ear becomes confused. Bones begin surrendering calcium. Muscles lose their familiar tasks. Sleep becomes something the brain has to relearn. 10 days is not long enough to create the profound degeneration seen on long station missions, but it is long enough to feel the body start negotiating with a world it was never designed for. Deep space does not care that Artemis II is historic. It does not care that the crew are brave or symbolic or carefully chosen. It simply acts on matter, and the astronauts are matter. That fact gives the mission its edge. This is not a story in which the environment admires the explorer. It is a story in which the explorer survives despite the environment. The rocket that should not be affordable and is not. The Space Launch System is a technical beast and an economic scandal at the same time. It is magnificent to look at. It is staggering in cost. Its core stage uses 4 RS-25 engines with heritage rooted in the Space Shuttle program. Flanking them are 2 giant solid rocket boosters. Together, they produce more thrust than the Saturn V at liftoff. When the SLS leaves the pad, it is not merely launching. It is overpowering gravity through violence on a scale the human body can barely intuit. And yet for all that grandeur, the SLS is also the product of years of delay, enormous cost, and a political industrial culture that has preserved it less because it is elegant than because it supports an entire ecosystem of contractors, states, jobs, and congressional interests. Each launch costs billions. The rocket is expendable. It is used once. Then much of it is discarded. Compared with the reusable logic now emerging in commercial launch systems, that feels almost like a relic from an alternate timeline. And the path to Artemis II's launch made that old-fashioned fragility impossible to ignore. Wet dress rehearsals revealed problems. Helium issues forced rollbacks. Launch day abort system concerns triggered tension just hours before liftoff. It all fed the central criticism. This machine is too expensive, too politically protected, and too cumbersome to be the true long-term backbone of a modern lunar program. And yet when launch came, it worked. That complicates the argument, because rockets exist to launch, and on that day the SLS did exactly what it was built to do. It produced a launch so powerful that people across the Florida coast felt it physically. Spectators described the light, the vibration, the chest-rattling force. Even critics had to acknowledge the brute reality of it. It worked. The harder question is whether working is enough to justify what it costs, how it was built, and how it fits into a lunar future that is increasingly being reshaped around commercial systems, international competition, and urgency. The money behind the mission. To understand Artemis, you have to stop thinking only like an engineer and start thinking like an auditor. The program has already consumed staggering sums. The total cost through the middle of the decade reaches a level that would have seemed unbelievable if not attached to official oversight and government accounting. Where did the money go? Into development, into delays, into preserving an industrial base, into cost-plus contracts that reward continuation as much as completion, into the sheer complexity of trying to resurrect crude lunar flight inside a modern American political system. That is the uncomfortable truth. Artemis is not simply a return to the moon. It is a collision between space exploration and the way modern government procurement works. Under cost-plus structures, contractors are reimbursed for expenses and guaranteed profit on top. That arrangement can encourage caution and continuity, but it can also weaken the natural financial pressure to be fast, lean, and efficient. In a political environment where preserving jobs and regional industrial capacity matters almost as much as technical performance, the result is a rocket that can survive even when its cost per launch looks increasingly indefensible. The frustration inside NASA's reform-minded leadership is easy to understand. The agency does not live in a vacuum. It sees what commercial launch has done. It sees the gap between old procurement logic and new engineering culture. It sees what happens when one system flies often, iterates fast, reuses hardware, and drives down cost, while another remains locked inside an architecture designed partly by committees, contracts, and districts. Artemis carries all of that inside it. So when people ask why the program feels both heroic and bloated, the answer is simple: because it is. The plan keeps changing. The Artemis roadmap that existed a short time ago is not the same roadmap that exists now. The Lunar Gateway, once presented as a central piece of the architecture, has effectively been dropped. Artemis III will not be the straightforward crude lunar landing many once expected. It has been restructured. Timelines have shifted. Commercial landers have become even more central. The logic of the Moon program is moving closer to a broader surface-building strategy rather than a neat orbital way station sequence. Why? Because the original timeline was not holding together. Because the landers are not all ready. Because the safety case is still being built. Because hard schedules collide with hard engineering. Because the Moon is not patient, but budgets and hardware delays are relentless. This does not mean the vision is dead. It means the vision is being rewritten in real time. What emerges is something both more ambitious and more fragile. A plan for repeated surface delivery, for infrastructure, for habitats, for power systems, for eventually establishing something like a permanent human presence. That is a huge dream. It is also one that sits on top of budget politics, contractor performance, re-entry survival, and the results of a heat shield test that has not yet happened. A lunar base can sound inevitable when presented on a stage. It feels much less inevitable when you remember that right now the fate of the near-term program may still depend on how the bottom of Orion behaves in plasma. China and the new race to the moon. The old space race was simple enough to teach to children. The United States, the Soviet Union, first satellite, first human, first moon landing. This new race is not so clean, but in some ways it may be more consequential. China is not treating the moon as a symbolic destination alone. It is building hardware, testing new systems, and moving toward a long-term lunar capability with visible seriousness. It has timelines, it has missions, it has a strategy, it has partners. The target is the lunar South Pole, so is NASA's, and the reason is not romance, it is water. Ice in permanently shadowed regions could transform what the moon means. Water means life support. It means oxygen. It means hydrogen. It means fuel. It means the possibility that the moon becomes more than a place to visit. It becomes a place to operate from. That changes everything. The first power that can establish reliable access, logistics, and infrastructure near those resources does not simply win a symbolic race. It shapes the practical future of lunar presence. That is why the language around Artemis has hardened. It is no longer only about exploration for exploration's sake. It is about leadership, competition, timelines, and not allowing a rival power to set the terms of the next era. Some of the official rhetoric says this plainly. The clock is running, months matter, years may be too long, and that urgency filters all the way down. It filters into program restructuring, into leadership frustration, into budget arguments, into the decision to fly Artemis II now, with crew, even under the shadow of the heat shield debate. Because if the United States wants to be first back to the moon in a meaningful way, delay is no longer politically neutral. That pressure is part of the mission, even if the 4 astronauts are not carrying it in their voices every minute. 53 years since the last human left the moon. To understand why Artemis II feels so emotionally charged, you have to sit for a moment with one date. December 14th, 1972. That was the day Eugene Cernan left the lunar surface during Apollo 17. He spoke of returning. Humanity did not in 73, not in 80, not in 99, not in 2010. For more than 50 years, no human being traveled beyond low Earth orbit. The moon became memory. Apollo became museum architecture, grainy footage, famous quotes, and a kind of impossible benchmark people used whenever they wanted to accuse the present of timidity. But Apollo did not end because the technology failed. It ended because politics moved on. The race had been won, public attention shifted, budgets shrank. The national story no longer required lunar flight in the same way it once had. Then came the shuttle, which promised routine access to space and gave the world both magnificent achievements and devastating losses. Challenger, Columbia, seared into memory for different reasons, but joined by a common thread. Institutions convincing themselves that known risks remained acceptable. That is why the heat shield issue on Artemis II lands so hard emotionally with so many veterans of the old program. They remember what NASA sounds like when it is confident. They remember what it sounds like when it is too confident. They know how easy it is for phrases like acceptable risk and within expected bounds to become lullabies sung to systems no one fully understands. Artemis II is not Challenger, it is not Columbia, but it lives in a NASA shaped by both, and that history makes every dissenting voice heavy. The flyby, the far side, and the view no one alive has seen. When Orion reaches lunar distance, the mission enters its most emotionally powerful phase. The moon fills the windows, not as a symbol, not as a distant object in the sky. As a place, from about 5,000 miles out, the scale changes. Craters become landscapes, shadows become architecture. Ridges and basins emerge with a kind of physicality that no telescope from Earth can quite reproduce in the human mind. And then there is the far side. Human beings have photographed it, probes have mapped it. Scientists know its broad geological character, but direct human sight is different. The far side is not simply the unseen side. It is the side that remained psychologically unavailable for most of human history. The side no one could ever look at from home. The side that makes the moon feel like a world instead of a face. Its terrain is harsher than the familiar near side. Fewer dark maria, more heavily cratered highlands, more ancient violence preserved in texture and shadow. Under partial lighting, the place becomes dramatic in a way almost impossible to overstate. The crew will photograph what they can, call out features, record impressions, follow target plans assembled by scientists on Earth. But beyond the technical work lies a more personal truth. They are seeing something almost no human beings have ever seen with their own eyes. Then comes one of the strangest and most beautiful moments of the mission, an eclipse from deep space. The sun hides behind the moon. The corona becomes visible. Darkness changes shape. The sky becomes something beyond ordinary night because there is no atmosphere, no airglow, no earthly softness to any of it. They may glimpse meteoroid flashes on the lunar surface, tiny points of violent light where rocks from space hit the moon at enormous speed. They may see phenomena difficult to capture from Earth with the same intimacy. And then, as Orion passes behind the moon, communications vanish. There is no line of sight, no Earth, no voice from mission control, just four people, a spacecraft named Integrity, and the far side. It may be the loneliest silence in the history of human coming home through fire. No matter how beautiful the flyby is, no matter how transcendent the view, no part of the mission changes the fact that to finish the story, Artemis II has to come home. And coming home is the part that may kill them. Low Earth orbit returns are violent enough. Lunar returns are something else entirely. Orion will hit the atmosphere at around 25,000 miles per hour. The spacecraft will convert enormous kinetic energy into heat, drag, plasma, and deceleration in a matter of minutes. During re-entry, the communications blackout begins. For about 5 minutes, the crew disappears. That blackout is expected. It is a known physical consequence of plasma surrounding the capsule and blocking radio transmission. But expected silence is still silence. It means mission control can do nothing but wait. It means families can do nothing but wait. It means everyone who has followed the mission must confront the simplest truth of deep space flight. At the most critical moment, no one on the ground can help. Inside the capsule, the crew will feel rising forces push them into their seats. The vehicle will shake. The heat shield will ablate. Material will crack, char, and disappear as designed, or perhaps not entirely as designed. Somewhere beneath all the modeling, all the engineering language, the actual material behavior will unfold in real time beyond anyone's ability to intervene. If the direct re-entry strategy truly solved the previous problem, Orion comes through. If it did not, there will be no time for second chances. That is the terror of re-entry. It is not a place where one can negotiate. Physics makes its judgment quickly. If the blackout ends the right way, communications return. Telemetry flows again. The drogue parachutes deploy. Then the main parachutes bloom. The capsule drops into the Pacific, battered, burned, and alive. Then the engineers go to work. Because even if the crew is safe, the program's future will depend on what the shield looks like when they inspect it. Did the material perform as hoped? Did the damage stay within expected limits? Did the new profile truly solve the earlier concern? Can Artemis continue without a fundamental redesign? Those answers are written not in speeches, but in scorch marks. What survival would mean? If Artemis II returns safely and the heat shield data supports NASA's decision, then the meaning of the mission changes instantly. It stops being a dangerous test flight and becomes the threshold mission of a new era. Artemis III, in its revised form, moves forward. The first true return-to-surface mission becomes more plausible. Lunar infrastructure plans regain credibility. Commercial lander integration matters more. The long-term moon base strategy stops sounding like a slideshow and starts sounding like a construction schedule. Surface habitats, power systems, cargo landings, rovers, resource extraction, semi-permanent occupation. All of that becomes easier to imagine if Artemis II proves the core crewed architecture can survive its hardest moments. If the mission fails, everything changes in a different direction. Timelines slip, confidence collapses. Critics harden, political patience thins. The program enters a new era of review, blame, redesign, and uncertainty. That is how much rides on this one flight. It is not just 4 people going around the moon. It is the credibility of an entire lunar return strategy. The view, the distance, and the human reason for any of this. There is a phrase astronauts use for what happens when they see Earth from space in a new way, the overview effect. It sounds clinical. It sounds like something a psychologist might put in a paper, but what it really describes is a crack in the normal arrangement of human meaning. From far away, Earth looks fragile, borders disappear, atmosphere becomes visibly thin. Problems that feel enormous at home begin to look strangely local, not unimportant, not solved, but local. Apollo 8 gave humanity Earthrise. That image changed the way millions of people thought about the planet. For Christina Koch, that image shaped a life. For the crew of Artemis II, the real version waits outside the window. And that is what makes the entire mission so morally complicated, because it is not purely noble, not purely cynical, not purely scientific, not purely geopolitical. It is all of those things at once. It is a program built through bureaucracy and political protection. It is a mission launched partly in the shadow of great power competition. It is a spacecraft carrying unresolved engineering questions. It is also 4 human beings going to the moon because some part of our species still refuses to stop reaching. That contradiction is not a flaw in the story. It is the story. Exploration has always lived in that uneasy space between wonder and power. Apollo was born from Cold War rivalry and still gave humanity one of its most transcendent perspectives. Artemis may be shaped by competition with China and still give the world another view that changes how we think. Sometimes the purest moments arrive through impure systems. Maybe that is just how human progress works. The budgets, the speeches, the rivalries, the contractors, the committees, the strategic urgency. Perhaps all of that is simply the machinery that gets a few people to a window where, for a moment, they can see something that changes the whole species. And maybe that is why, even now, someone still says yes. A widowed father says yes. A pilot listening to a poem about injustice says yes. A woman who stared at Earthrise on her bedroom wall says yes. A Canadian rookie with maple syrup in his cargo bag says yes. They say yes to the rocket, to the risk, to the heat shield, to the blackout, to the distance, to the possibility that the mission may go wrong in ways no one can reverse. And then they go. Right now, as this story continues, they are still out there. The moon is still ahead of them. The far side is still waiting. The heat shield has not yet met the atmosphere. The blackout has not yet come. The parachutes have not yet opened. We do not yet know the ending, and that uncertainty may be the most honest part of the whole mission, because this is what exploration looks like before history tidies it up. Not clean triumph, not flawless courage, not simple patriotism. It looks like glitches, stress, engineering disagreement, cramped living quarters, radiation exposure, political pressure, family sacrifice, and a handful of people willing to place their bodies inside a machine and travel farther than any living human has ever gone. At the center of Artemis II, beneath all the cost and all the tension, there is one image that refuses to go away. 4 people in a small capsule, 250,000 miles from home, looking out a window, watching Earth shrink behind them, knowing exactly how far they are from everyone they love, and still going. That may not resolve the argument over whether the mission is worth it, but it does explain why humanity keeps trying. Because somewhere deep inside the species, beneath all the caution and all the memory of disaster, there is still a force strong enough to overcome comfort. Not stronger than physics, not stronger than fire, not stronger than death, but strong enough to make people leave home and head for the horizon anyway. Artemis II is not just a mission to the moon. It is a test of memory, a test of engineering, a test of politics, a test of risk, a test of whether a civilization that once went to the moon and then stayed away for 53 years still knows how to do difficult things with courage and honesty. Soon enough, Orion will tell us. The answer will arrive in plasma, in silence, in parachutes, in burned material, in the relieved voices of astronauts if the mission survives. And if it does, then one of the oldest roads in human imagination will be open again. For now, though, the story remains unfinished. Somewhere out there, 4 human beings are still moving through the dark between worlds. The Earth is behind them, the moon is ahead, and all of human hope, fear, ambition, pride, memory, and uncertainty are traveling with them inside a spacecraft called in. And maybe that is what makes Artemis II feel so different from the Apollo missions we remember. Apollo lives in memory as certainty. Even when people know intellectually that Apollo was dangerous, that people died in testing, that equipment failed, that margins were thin, the missions themselves are usually remembered in hindsight. The photographs are sharp, the quotes are famous, the outcomes are already known. We remember the flag, the footprints, the Earthrise, the grainy television signal, the calm voices from mission control. But Artemis II does not live in hindsight. It lives in suspense. That changes everything. It means every problem feels sharper because it has not yet been softened by history. Every alarm still carries its full emotional weight. Every engineering argument still feels alive because the outcome has not come along afterward to prove one side right and the other wrong. Every public statement still sounds provisional. Every expression of confidence still has an edge to it because confidence has not yet been tested by the final minutes of re-entry. And so Artemis II feels less like a monument and more like a nerve. You can touch it and feel the tension running through the whole thing. You can feel it in the crew's language, in the way they talk about the mission with wonder, but also with discipline, with humor, but also with gravity. You can feel it in the way officials frame the risks, always careful, always composed, always aware that one wrong phrase can become tomorrow's headline. You can feel it in the engineers who speak in the strange double language of aerospace, a language where words like acceptable, bounded, and nominal are meant to reassure, even when the reality underneath them is still deeply uncertain. And perhaps nowhere is that tension more visible than in mission control itself. Because if spaceflight has a theater, mission control is its stage. Not because it is dramatic in the cinematic sense, but because it is where modern faith in systems goes to confront the possibility that systems may still fail. Rows of consoles, monitors glowing in darkened rooms, voices clipped, measured, calm, headsets, status boards, procedures, redundancy layered on redundancy. On the surface, it looks like certainty made architectural. But under that surface, mission control is not a temple of certainty. It is a room built to hold anxiety without letting anxiety take command. Think for a moment about what the controllers in Houston know. They know that once Orion leaves Earth orbit, there is no practical rescue option. No one is launching another spacecraft to intercept them. No emergency crew is on standby in lunar space. No magical contingency exists that can erase distance. If the crew gets into trouble far enough out, mission control's greatest power is not intervention. It is diagnosis. The ability to understand what is happening, to think clearly under pressure, to offer the best possible path through a situation they cannot physically touch. That is both reassuring and terrifying. Reassuring because the people at those consoles are some of the most capable specialists on Earth. Terrifying because even perfect understanding cannot always save a mission once certain lines are crossed. This is one of the paradoxes of human spaceflight. The farther we go, the more control seems to slip away from our hands, even as our machines become more advanced. We can measure more, model more, simulate more, predict more. But prediction is not protection. Analysis is not rescue. There comes a point on every deep space mission where the crew is living inside the consequences of earlier decisions, and mission control becomes less a place of command than a place of witness, intelligence, and desperate calm. That was true during Apollo. It is true again now, and the people in those rooms know the history too well to pretend otherwise. They know the sequence of Challenger. They know the disintegration of Columbia. They know how easily confidence becomes ritual. They know how dangerous it is when the language of safety begins to sound too polished, too repetitive, too comfortable. Which is why the warnings around Artemis II matter so much. Not because descent automatically means doom. Not because engineering disagreement proves the mission is reckless, but because the healthiest aerospace cultures are the ones where dissent is heard clearly before flight, not reinterpreted gently afterward. The fact that some respected figures looked at the heat shield situation and said, in effect, "I would not fly on this," should sit heavily with anyone paying attention. Not because those voices are guaranteed to be right, but because human spaceflight history is littered with moments where the most important thing anyone said was treated as merely one opinion among many until disaster turned it into prophecy. NASA knows this. The astronauts know this. The people in mission control know this. And still, the mission flew. That decision tells us something profound about Artemis II. It is not a mission launched in a climate of universal comfort. It is a mission launched because the balance of risk, urgency, politics, engineering judgment, and institutional momentum tipped hard enough in one direction that saying yes became more powerful than saying wait. Whether that was wisdom or impatience is a question history has not answered yet, and that is what makes this story feel so alive. It is not resolved. The judgment is still coming. It will arrive in heat, plasma, silence, and data. Until then, all we have is the shape of the mission as it unfolds and the people living inside it. Let us go back inside Orion for a moment. Because one of the strangest things about deep space flight is how quickly the extraordinary become. Launch is violence, Earth departure is history, lunar distance is myth made real, and yet, after enough hours in a spacecraft, even myth settles into routine. People still need to wake up, still need to eat, still need to clean up, still need to organize tasks, still need to manage mood, exhaustion, boredom, and the tiny frictions of living with three other human beings in a tightly enclosed machine. There is a tendency in public storytelling to imagine astronauts as living in a permanent state of awe. But awe is not sustainable for 10 days, not continuously. Human beings normalize. That is one of our great strengths. Even in the strangest environments, the mind eventually starts converting the incomprehensible into routine. The view outside remains astonishing, yes, but after a while, the task list reasserts itself. The body wants a schedule. The mission timeline wants discipline. There are checklists to run, systems to monitor, procedures to rehearse, camera plans to follow, reports to send, exercise periods to complete. This is what makes astronauts so unusual, not simply that they can endure danger, but that they can remain operational inside it. The ability to float 200,000 miles from home and still troubleshoot a water system, still follow a timeline, still fix a software issue, still wait your turn at the window, still eat, still exercise, still sleep, still do the next thing. That may be as impressive as any symbolic milestone, because deep space flight does not only test courage, it tests executive function. It tests the ability to remain useful while existing inside an environment whose very existence would overwhelm most people's nervous systems. Imagine trying to sleep knowing you are farther from Earth than anyone alive has ever been. Imagine waking up and realizing the nearest breathable atmosphere is 250,000 miles away. Imagine floating to the window and seeing Earth not as a world around you, but as an object behind you. Imagine trying to keep your mind inside the ordinary sequence of tasks when the deepest part of your imagination is screaming that none of this should be possible. The crew must do exactly that. And maybe that is why astronauts often become strangely funny in flight. Not because the mission is light, but because humor is one of the few human tools that can keep the impossible from becoming psychologically unmanageable. The outlook moment matters for that reason. The toilet moment matters for that reason. Every small, ridiculous, ordinary detail becomes a pressure valve, because without that pressure release, deep space flight could become too abstract, too huge, too overwhelming to inhabit comfortably. This is something Apollo crews understood too. When we read their transcripts now, what surprises us is not only the brilliance, but the normality, the jokes, the annoyance, the bickering. The observations about food, sleep, smell, physical discomfort, minor mechanical irritation. The human mind protects itself by carrying the ordinary into the extraordinary. Artemis II is no different. The mission may represent national ambition, strategic urgency, and the return of humans to lunar space. Inside the capsule, it is also four people figuring out how to exist together for 10 days without letting the scale of the mission crush the small human routines that keep them sane. And that question of sanity matters more than most people realize, because lunar missions are not merely technical operations. They are psychological experiments under conditions no natural human environment ever prepared us for. Think of the sensory environment inside Orion. No wind, no outdoor sounds, no natural horizon, no true day and night in the earthly sense, no changing weather, no random human noise from a city, a house, a neighborhood, a world. Instead, there are only systems, fans, pumps, instrument tones, clicks, voices on comm loops, the muted thumps of bodies moving against restraints, the almost sacred importance of a familiar sound. In such a place, even little things become emotionally charged. A favorite food packet, a family keepsake, a familiar song, a phrase from home, a scheduled call, a view through the window. The farther from Earth you go, the more any fragment of Earth begins to matter. This is one reason the crew biographies are not just public relations material. They matter to the mission. The objects people bring, the emotional references they carry, the personal rituals they maintain, those are not sentimental decorations hanging off the side of hard engineering. They are part of the survival system. Victor Glover's music is part of the survival system. Reid Wiseman's private thoughts in his notebook are part of the survival system. Christina Koch's long relationship to the image of Earthrise is part of the survival system. Jeremy Hansen's moon pendants and maple syrup are part of the survival system. None of these things keep the capsule pressurized, none of them fix the heat shield, none of them block radiation, but they keep the self intact. And the self is part of the mission. Aerospace medicine knows this. Operations psychology knows this. Any serious long-duration spaceflight planner knows this. A crew does not survive on oxygen and engineering alone. It survives on coherence, on morale, on the ability to remain emotionally continuous with life on Earth, even while drifting farther from it than any living person has ever gone. That emotional continuity becomes even more important because Artemis II sits in an awkward zone between short mission and historic mission. 10 days is not long enough to become a true expedition in the way that future lunar surface or Mars missions would be. But it is long enough for the crew to feel the distance, long enough for the body to begin adapting, long enough for Earth to stop feeling immediate, long enough for the risk to become ordinary and therefore, in some ways, more dangerous. There is a specific kind of risk that appears after the first great dramatic moments have passed. The launch is over, the big burn is over, the panic alarms have passed, the immediate adrenaline begins to thicken. Then comes the psychological middle, the place where confidence can either stabilize into professionalism or drift into complacency. That is another reason why mission rhythm matters so much. Tasks protect people. Checklists protect people. Structure protects people. In a way, procedure is one of the deepest forms of kindness spaceflight ever invented, because procedure takes the human mind and keeps it from wandering too far into fear, too far into fantasy, too far into the dangerous space where people stop doing the next necessary thing because they are too overwhelmed by the totality of where they are. And yet the totality is always there, always just beyond the task list. Earth behind, moon ahead, heat shield below, radiation outside, silence all around. This is why the great space missions are always more than engineering stories. They are stories about the human ability to remain meaningful inside scales of reality that should erase meaning. That brings us back to the moon itself. For most of human history, the moon was a symbol before it was a destination. It was a calendar, a god, a face, a mystery, a poetic object, a guide to tides, a marker of time, a companion to night. It hovered over every civilization as something both intimate and unreachable. Then, in the 20th century, the moon changed categories. It became a target, then a destination, then a memory, and now perhaps a frontier again. That sequence matters. Because every time a society changes the category of the moon, it changes something in itself as well. When the moon was only symbol, it belonged to imagination. When it became a destination, it belonged to ambition. When it became memory, it belonged to nostalgia. If it becomes frontier again, it will belong to logistics, competition, infrastructure, and permanence. That is what Artemis is really testing. Not simply whether humans can go around the moon again. We already know they can, at least in principle. The deeper test is whether modern civilization still knows how to turn the unimaginable into routine. That was Apollo's greatest achievement in a way, not just planting flags or collecting rocks. Apollo compressed the impossible into procedure. It took something that had belonged to mythology and made it the outcome of checklists, engineering drawings, navigation equations, and disciplined execution. It made the moon into a thing human beings could do. Artemis is trying to do that again, but in a different world. Apollo operated in the fever of geopolitical emergency. The mission was clear: beat the Soviets, land first. Prove superiority. The public did not need a 10-point white paper explaining why the moon mattered. The urgency was culturally self-evident. Artemis does not have that luxury. Its justifications are multiple and therefore weaker in a rhetorical sense. Science, prestige, technology development, international leadership, competition with China, inspiration, industrial base preservation, future Mars preparation, lunar resources, national purpose. All of these arguments exist at once, and because they exist at once, none of them has the singular brutal clarity Apollo had. That makes Artemis more realistic and also more vulnerable. Because when a mission must justify itself in many languages at once, it can be criticized in many languages too. Too expensive, too slow, too political. Too dangerous, too symbolic, not ambitious enough, too ambitious, too dependent on old contractors, too dependent on unproven commercial systems, too shaped by Congress, too shaped by urgency. Artemis II carries all of those criticisms with it. And still, the mission launched, which tells us something important about the psychology of nations. Sometimes a civilization chooses to move not because all the arguments are resolved, but because it has become more dangerous not to move. That may be the deeper logic at work here. China matters, yes. The South Pole matters, yes. The base-building future matters, yes. But there may also be something even more fundamental in play. A great power that stops doing difficult things in public starts teaching itself that difficulty is someone else's domain. That is corrosive. It affects more than aerospace. It affects imagination. It affects national self-concept. It affects what younger generations think adulthood, science, engineering, and courage are for. This is one reason NASA leadership talks so much about children dressing up as astronauts for Halloween, or about the need for visible, ambitious missions. To some people, that sounds sentimental. To others, manipulative. But there is a truth buried inside it. Civilizations need images of capability. They need visible acts that tell the next generation, in effect. There are still frontiers, still hard things, still reasons to build, still reasons to become scientists and pilots and engineers and thinkers. That does not make Artemis morally simple. It does not excuse waste or weak engineering decisions, but it does explain why the mission matters beyond its immediate technical goals. It is a cultural act, a wager that a society still benefits from doing visibly difficult things even when those things are imperfect, compromised, expensive, and argued over. The danger, of course, is that such wagers can become self-justifying. If inspiration becomes the excuse for ignoring real engineering concern, then the mission turns from noble to irresponsible. That is the line every serious human spaceflight program has to walk. And it is precisely why the dissent around Artemis II should not be brushed aside just because the launch succeeded. A successful launch does not prove a program wise. A beautiful rocket does not prove a system healthy. A brave crew does not erase engineering uncertainty. A historic mission does not automatically justify every risk taken to make it happen. The ethical center of Artemis II lives there, not in whether the moon is inspiring. Of course it is. not in whether the crew is admirable. Of course they are, but in whether admiration and inspiration are being asked to carry too much weight in a situation where real material uncertainty still exists. That question becomes sharper the closer we get to re-entry, because re-entry is the part of the mission where symbolism disappears. In launch, there is spectacle. In the coast, there is wonder. At the moon, there is awe. During re-entry, there is only truth. The heat shield will either behave within survivable limits or it will not. No speech can help. No program roadmap can help. No geopolitical framing can help. No Earthrise memory can help. The crew will be inside a fire, and the capsule will live or die by material behavior at temperatures beyond normal human intuition. That is why so much of the mission feels like it is actually waiting for one moment. The blackout. Everything before it is prelude. Everything after it is consequence. That does not mean the journey out is unimportant. Far from it. The flyby, the radiation environment, the operations, the psychological realities, the navigation, the communications, all of it matters deeply. But emotionally and politically, the mission's fate condenses into those minutes when plasma cuts the spacecraft off from Earth and everyone must wait. This waiting has a long history in spaceflight. Mercury crews waited for re-entry. Gemini crews waited. Apollo crews waited. Shuttle families waited. Soyuz recovery teams waited. Dragon controllers wait. But a lunar return blackout carries a different psychological texture. It is longer in memory, if not necessarily in clock time. Heavier, more absolute, less forgiving, because no one can watch the trajectory unfold the way they can in ordinary flight. There is a wall of physics between knowledge and ignorance. 1 second the craft is a stream of telemetry. The next it is silence wrapped in incandescent gas. The people in Houston know this. The families know this. The public learns it in an abstract way. The crew feels it physically. And once you imagine that moment honestly, the rest of the mission changes color. The moon is still beautiful. The mission is still historic. The competition is still real. But everything now has the shadow of those 5 minutes stretched behind it, which is why it matters so much that the astronauts still speak about wonder. They know more than most people do. They have read the dissenting reports. They have lived the simulations. They know the systems intimately. They know what could go wrong, and still they talk about the view. That is not denial. It is one of the great lessons of astronauts across history. People who understand risk most intimately are often the people least interested in surrendering wonder to it. That may be the highest form of courage spaceflight teaches, not recklessness, not macho indifference, not pretending fear does not exist, but the ability to know exactly how real the risk is and still remain open to beauty. Victor Glover staring out the window, Reid Wiseman feeling the full gravity of the burn, Christina Koch preparing to see with her own eyes the image that changed her life, Jeremy Hansen unable to get to lunch because the view will not let him go. These details matter because they keep the mission from collapsing into mere engineering argument. Artemis II is not just about whether NASA made the right call. It is also about what happens when human beings stand again at a threshold their species has abandoned for half a century and decide to cross it anyway. Thresholds matter. A civilization can live off old thresholds for a long time. It can remember Apollo, quote Apollo, build museums around Apollo, project clips of Saturn V launches onto giant screens, and let nostalgia do the work of ambition. But at some point, if it wants to remain alive in the deeper sense, it has to create new thresholds. Artemis II may be one, not because it lands, it does not because it solves the moon, it cannot, but because it restores one terrifying, necessary fact to human experience, there are still places our species can go that feel dangerous enough to matter. That is easy to romanticize. It is also hard to defend ethically. Why should any family bear that? Why should any crew fly with unresolved concern? Why should taxpayers fund such risk at such cost? Why should national ambition ever place 4 people in a small spacecraft with no rescue option and a heat shield still under public debate? Those are not anti-space questions. They are adult questions, and any honest documentary about Artemis II has to let them remain alive. Because if you remove those questions, the mission becomes propaganda. And propaganda is useless in the face of fire, so let us stay with the ambiguity. Maybe Artemis II is an act of necessary courage. Maybe it is an act of institutional impatience. Maybe it is both. Maybe the direct re-entry decision will prove brilliant and the concerns, while serious, will ultimately look like the normal healthy descent of a functioning aerospace culture. Maybe the mission will come home and retroactively justify the confidence shown by leadership. Or maybe the mission is one of those moments where a system convinced itself that changing the trajectory was enough, because changing the hardware in time was too difficult, too expensive, or too disruptive to the schedule. We do not know yet, and because we do not know yet, Artemis II remains one of the most honest kinds of historical story, a live one whose moral balance has not yet been assigned by the comfort of hindsight. That means we are left with something rare, a mission still unfolding, a crew still in transit, a danger still ahead, a program still unproven, a moon still not yet reclaimed. And in the middle of all of that, 4 human beings floating in a volume scarcely larger than a car interior, eating rehydrated food, fixing software, sharing one toilet, staring out 2 windows, and carrying with them the full burden of half a century of waiting. Maybe that is the image worth holding on to, not the giant rocket, not the price tag, not even the moon itself, but the fact that after 53 years, the road is open again, and the first people on it are still recognizably human. Tired, funny, disciplined, afraid, hopeful, professional, mortal, and willing. That willingness is the one thing no machine can generate. Budgets do not create it. Politics do not create it. Contract structures do not create it. Programs do not create it. Individuals create it. A man sits with his daughters and explains the papers. A pilot picks his launch music. A woman carries a childhood image toward the place it came from. A rookie accepts the largest possible version of his first flight. Then the hatch closes, and they go. That may not answer whether the mission is worth the risk, but it explains why the question remains alive at all. Because without people willing to carry risk into the unknown, the moon becomes a story we tell about what our grandparents once did. With them, it becomes a future again. And right now, somewhere between Earth and the moon, the future is still floating inside a spacecraft named Integrity. N let 1 EBF, UB let 1 EA1N, MU let 1 ED1N. Min S let 1 EBDV, I let 1 EBF, TT, I let 1 EBF, P and Gay, PH letter 1 E7N, CU letter 1 ED1, I destruct let 1 EC3 Gape, San B let 1 E3N, Full Die Hon N letter 1 EF, Theo Dung M let 1 E1 CH Nai, Cho Sat Hon B let 1 E3N 3T I let 1 EBF, NG Hon CH letter 1 EC9NH Dung Voice. Okay, thought for 12s. D let 1 B0 let 1 EDB, I day la PH let 1 E7N, N let 1 ED1, IT I let 1 EBF, PT I let 1 EBF, P Theo. VI letter 1 EBF, T Theo Dung K I letter 1 EC3 US English. Voice ready, cinematic documentary. Destruct letter 1 EC3, B letter 1 EA1N Gape, TH letter 1 EB3NG, Vow B letter 1 EA3N, T R letter 1 B0, letter 1 EDBC. Extended continuation. Continue directly after the previous section. And maybe that is the hardest thing to explain to anyone who has never cared deeply about space. Why go at all? Why accept a mission this expensive, this politically tangled, this mechanically exposed, this emotionally costly? Why strap 4 people into a spacecraft when the toilet has already jammed, the radios have already gone silent once, the leak warning has already flashed, and the one piece of hardware that matters most on the way home is the very piece of hardware some respected voices still do not fully trust? It is an uncomfortable question because every honest answer sounds incomplete. We go for science, yes. We go for national prestige, yes. We go because the moon is a proving ground for later missions, yes. We go because China is moving, yes. We go because the South Pole may hold the resources that turn a dead world into an operating base, yes. We go because entire generations of engineers, astronauts, and planners have spent careers building toward this moment, yes. And underneath all of that, we go for a reason so old it predates politics, budgets, rockets, and even civilization itself. We go because there is still a horizon. That answer is not sufficient for a budget hearing. It is not sufficient for a safety board. It is certainly not sufficient for the daughters of a single father sitting inside a capsule on his way to the moon. And one of the things Artemis II forces us to confront is that exploration has always been made out of layers. The official reason, the strategic reason, the technical reason, the private reason. The reason someone gives at a press conference. The reason someone tells their family. The reason someone never says aloud at all, because it is too large or too irrational or too difficult to translate into the language of modern institutions. Every astronaut on Artemis II carries all of those layers inside them. That is one reason the mission feels so charged. The public story is huge, but the private stories are just as large in their own way. A father's will, a childhood poster, a launch song from the Apollo era, a bag packed with small reminders of home. These are not side details. They are how giant historical acts become human scale again. Because the truth is that almost nobody can emotionally comprehend what it means to go 250,000 miles from Earth. We can repeat the number, 252,021 miles. We can admire the number. We can say it with reverence, but our brains do not truly hold it. The number is too large in one sense and too empty in another. It does not tell you what it feels like when Earth stops behaving like a world and starts behaving like an object. It does not tell you what it feels like to look at home and realize that every city, every ocean, every hospital, every airport, every parent, every child, every grave, every nation, every argument, every song, every meal you have ever known is compressed into a small glowing sphere hanging behind you in blackness. Numbers do not tell that story. Windows do, and the people inside Orion know that. It is no accident that so much of what they say returns to the view, not because the view is sentimental and not because they are trying to sell the mission to the public, but because the view is the one thing that makes the risk emotionally legible. The moon matters intellectually. The heat shield matters technically. The budget matters politically. But the window matters existentially. The window is where the mission becomes real. This was true in Apollo 2. When Bill Anders photographed Earthrise during Apollo 8, he was not following some grand cultural mandate to transform humanity's environmental consciousness. He was reacting like a human being seeing something impossible and trying to hold it before it vanished. Only later did the image become history. Only later did critics and writers and environmental thinkers talk about what it meant. In the moment, it was still just a crew at a window, suddenly aware that the planet they had always lived on had become visible as a whole. That kind of moment changes the species in ways policy cannot plan. Artemis II carries the possibility of another such moment, maybe not a single iconic photograph, maybe not one frame that enters history the way Earthrise did, but perhaps something else, another shift, another reminder, another slight but irreversible change in how human beings imagine themselves in relation to their own world. That is why the mission carries a strange moral tension, because on one hand, it is almost impossible to argue that a civilization should stop producing such moments entirely. A species that never again leaves low Earth orbit, never again challenges itself with journeys that reorder perspective, risks shrinking in ways that are hard to quantify, not just technologically, imaginatively. And on the other hand, it is equally difficult to argue that perspective alone justifies any level of risk. The ore cannot erase the engineering debate. The beauty cannot absolve the institutions if they made the wrong call. No one gets to say, after the fact, that the view was worth a preventable death if the preventability was real and known in advance. This is the knife-edge Artemis II walks. It is a mission suspended between transcendence and accountability. And those two values are not always easy to reconcile. The closer you get to the heart of the mission, the more that becomes clear, because this is not a mission where danger is concentrated in one neat place. It is distributed, layered. Some of it is mechanical, some of it is environmental, some of it is political, some of it is cultural. Some of it is the oldest danger of all, the danger that an institution, once committed to movement, may gradually lose the emotional ability to stop itself. That is why the comparisons to Challenger and Columbia hover so stubbornly around this mission even when officials resist them. No one is saying Artemis II is a repeat of those disasters in a direct sense. The hardware is different. The scenario is different. The technical logic is different, but the pattern people fear is not hardware-specific. The pattern is institutional, a known concern, a schedule that matters, a culture under pressure, models treated as sufficient. Dissent acknowledged but not allowed to dominate. Confidence presented as responsible. That pattern can reappear under many forms, and when it does, the burden on leadership becomes enormous. NASA leadership knows that. The current administrator knows that. The astronauts know that. You can hear it in the cautious way they speak. Even their confidence often sounds disciplined rather than exuberant. This is not a program drunk on pure optimism. It is a program trying to sound steady while carrying a lot of internal weight. There is another layer here too, one that people rarely talk about directly. Human spaceflight has always depended on a kind of moral delegation. Most of the public does not examine thermal protection system erosion data. Most of the public does not read Inspector General reports about mission architecture. Most people cannot independently assess whether a particular decision on a heat shield is wise or reckless. They delegate trust. They assume that if the mission flies, the people involved have decided it is within bounds. That trust is powerful. It is also fragile, because once broken, it is hard to rebuild. Challenger broke it. Columbia broke it again. Every future mission inherits that damage. Artemis II, therefore, carries not just the risk of its own outcome, but the risk of what its outcome would do to public belief in deep space flight. If it succeeds, confidence expands. If it fails under the shadow of warnings that now look visible in advance, the damage goes far beyond one vehicle. It would reach into the cultural legitimacy of the entire return to the moon effort. This is what makes the decision to fly with crew so consequential. An uncrewed Artemis II would have tested the direct re-entry change with lower moral stakes. The data would still have mattered. The shield would still have been tested. The program could still have moved forward if the results were strong. But NASA chose the crude path. That choice tells you that the mission is not only about testing hardware, it is also about momentum. A human crew creates urgency no robot can create. It forces attention. It reopens the emotional channel between the public and lunar flight. It makes the mission matter now, not merely as a technical milestone, but as a national and global event. In political terms, that is powerful. In moral terms, it is dangerous, because momentum is one of the oldest sources of trouble in large systems. Once a crew is assigned, once training is public, once dates are announced, once launch windows are discussed, once biographies are featured and families are interviewed, stopping becomes harder. Not technically harder, emotionally and institutionally harder. There is a reason veteran safety cultures become allergic to momentum. Momentum sounds like progress. It often is progress. It can also become anesthesia. Which is why Artemis II should be watched not as a simple triumphant return, but as a case study in how modern high-risk institutions decide what they can live with. That phrase matters, not what they can prove, not what they can guarantee, what they can live with. The astronauts live with the mission in one way, the engineers live with it in another, the administrators in another, the families in another still. And none of those forms of living with risk are identical. Reid Wiseman lives with it by telling his daughters where to find the will. Victor Glover lives with it by carrying historical consciousness into the cockpit. Christina Koch lives with it by tying the mission to a lifetime of meaning. Jeremy Hansen lives with it by accepting the impossible as his first real flight experience. Mission Control lives with it by staying calm enough to think. NASA leadership lives with it by standing behind the decision publicly. Critics live with it by speaking now before the outcome arrives, while warning still means something. The public lives with it mostly by trusting. And the problem with trust is that it cannot be audited after the fact. It can only be rewarded or betrayed. That is part of the burden sitting invisibly inside this mission. There is another burden too, and it belongs to the crew in a way that no amount of public admiration can lighten: the burden of symbolic firsts. Victor Glover carries one kind. Christina Koch carries another. Jeremy Hansen carries another still. Public discourse loves firsts. They are easy to headline, easy to celebrate, easy to package into meaning, but firsts are rarely experienced by the people living them as pure symbolic glory. They are often experienced as complexity, responsibility, awareness that your body is being used to close a historical gap that should have been closed earlier or differently or under better conditions. Victor Glover knows what it means to be the first black person beyond low Earth orbit. That is not just a line in a biography. It is a sentence that contains generations of exclusion, aspiration, anger, triumph, and contradiction. When he listens to Whitey on the moon before launch, he is refusing the simplification that often accompanies milestone language. He is saying, in effect, that history does not become clean just because it finally includes you. Progress can still be uneven. Symbolism can still coexist with unresolved injustice. The flight can still be magnificent and morally complicated at the same time. Christina Koch knows something similar from a different angle. Being the first woman to travel to the moon is not simply a personal achievement. It is also a reminder of how long that took. The gap between Apollo and Artemis is not only technological, it is social, it is institutional, it is about who got invited into the imagination of spaceflight and who did not. Koch is not merely inheriting the lunar story, she is changing its grammar. Jeremy Hansen carries a national first, the first Canadian to travel to the moon. That too may sound straightforward until you think about what it means in the context of modern exploration. Artemis is framed as American leadership, yes, but it is also framed as a multinational system of alliances and contributions. Hansen's presence makes the crew feel less like a national throwback and more like a coalition-era lunar mission. That matters symbolically because it changes who gets to imagine themselves inside the future. And then there is Reid Wiseman, whose symbolic role is not about category but about archetype. He is the father. In some ways, the single father of two daughters may be the most emotionally legible figure in the whole crew, not because the others are less human, but because the image is so immediate. A parent leaving, a will in the drawer. A family having the conversation no family wants to have. It cuts through every abstraction the mission generates. We speak easily of national ambition. We speak easily of lunar architecture. We speak easily of risk models and re-entry trajectories. A father telling his daughters whether documents are ends that ease instantly. It makes the risk impossible to discuss in clean institutional language ever again. That is why the human stories matter so much. They stop the mission from becoming bloodless. At the same time, there is a danger in focusing too much on heroism. Space programs know how to tell heroic stories. They know how to stage photos, frame interviews, evoke sacrifice, and let the courage of individuals soften the harder questions about institutional decision-making. So it is important to keep both truths together. The astronauts are genuinely courageous. Their courage does not automatically prove the institution made the right call. In fact, one of the oldest dangers in high-risk programs is allowing the courage of the participants to become a substitute for the adequacy of the system around them. Heroes can normalize weak decisions by enduring them well. That is not their fault. It is simply So the honest way to tell Artemis II is to honor the crew fully without letting admiration sedate judgment. They are extraordinary, and the mission remains arguable. Both things are true. As the spacecraft continues its coast, the psychological landscape inside the cabin keeps evolving. At first, the mission is full of the shock of departure. Then it becomes routine enough to inhabit. Then, as lunar distance closes, another transition begins. Anticipation deepens. The moon ahead is no longer only a target on a timeline. It becomes visible, real, textured, approaching. This is one of the most interesting transitions in any long journey, the movement from concept to object. At launch, the moon is an idea attached to a mission profile. During the coast, it becomes a destination. During the approach, it becomes a place that physically occupies the crew's vision. That change matters because it alters the emotional center of the mission. Suddenly, the crew is no longer merely writing a plan. They are entering an encounter. And encounters change people, not always dramatically, not always in the speech-ready, life-changing way documentaries like to emphasize. Sometimes the change is quieter, a rearrangement of scale, a new register of humility. A shift in what feels large and what feels small. The moon has always been good at doing that to human beings. Apollo crews returned speaking not only about achievement, but about perspective, about Earth, about fragility, about absurd borders and enormous silence. That is one reason spaceflight stories so often become philosophical even when they begin as engineering stories. The farther you go from home, the harder it becomes to think in ordinary scales. Eventually, the mind starts to treat politics, identity, biology, grief, and beauty differently simply because the frame has changed. Artemis II will likely do the same to its crew, perhaps not in identical ways, perhaps not in fully shareable ways. Each astronaut will have their own private reaction to the far side, to the shrinking Earth, to the silence behind the moon, to the eclipse, to the realization that no living person has stood where they stand in more than half a century. Those reactions may never all become public, and that is as it should be. Not every experience at the threshold of human reach exists for the audience. Some of it belongs to the people who were there. Some of it belongs to memory before it belongs to history. Still, the mission will produce images, words, fragments, public language shaped after the fact, and in those fragments, the rest of us will try once again to imagine what it means to float that far from home. Home, that word matters more in lunar flight than in orbital flight. People say, coming home, after a mission from the International Space Station too, of course. But in low Earth orbit, Earth never fully stops feeling near. You are circling it constantly. It fills the view. Rescue is difficult but thinkable. The atmosphere is close, the planet vast, the sense of home never entirely abstracted. At lunar distance, home becomes something else. It is no longer the environment around you. It is an object at a distance. That distinction may seem poetic, but it has real psychological consequences. Once home becomes an object, you understand vulnerability differently. You understand separation differently. Distance becomes emotional, not just geometric. This is one reason Apollo 8 changed people. It was not merely the first crewed lunar mission. It was the first time human beings became small enough in relation to Earth to see the planet as home rather than habitat. Artemis II returns to that threshold, and because it returns after such a long silence, the threshold feels heavier. Apollo's crews flew in an age when lunar travel was still becoming imaginable. They were the first wave. The giant, impossible act was becoming procedure in front of the whole world. Artemis inherits a different burden. It returns after abandonment, after decades of not going, after generations grew up treating human beings on the moon as something their grandparents watched on old television rather than something the species still did. That gap has consequences. It means Artemis II is carrying not just a crew, but a broken continuity. It is trying to stitch one era back onto another. That is a dangerous thing to do, not only technically, culturally. Continuity, once broken, is hard to repair. Skills atrophy, institutions age, political will becomes inconsistent, public expectations become distorted, nostalgia replaces competence. Symbols remain while the systems that once supported them decay. Artemis exists inside that damaged continuity. It wants to behave like the beginning of a new age while also carrying the memory of a lost old one. That is a difficult balance. Too much Apollo nostalgia, and the program becomes trapped in reverence, forever measuring itself against a golden age rather than building a different future. Too little connection to Apollo, and the public loses the emotional bridge that makes lunar flight intelligible at all. Artemis II walks that line constantly. Launch Pad 39B, the Deep Space Network carrying human voices again, the Earthrise memory, the phrase, back to the moon. The return after 53 years. All of that language invites comparison, and comparison is dangerous because Apollo was in some ways simpler to justify and in other ways much more reckless. It was politically clear, morally messier, and publicly bolder. Artemis is bureaucratically slower, technologically more distributed, politically less clear, and ethically more self-conscious. That does not make one better than the other. It makes them products of different civilizations. Apollo belonged to an America willing to spend astonishing money to win a symbolic race and accept staggering risk under a national mood shaped by Cold War urgency. Artemis belongs to an America that must justify every giant act through layers of politics, commerce, international coordination, safety review, public scrutiny, and strategic competition with a rising rival that plays by different rules. That difference matters. It means the cultural conditions that produce lunar flight have changed almost as much as the hardware has. And maybe that is why Artemis II feels so exposed. The mission has to carry too many meanings at once. Test flight, public spectacle, national signal, engineering proof, human firsts, strategic urgency, prelude to a base, moral argument about exploration, case study in institutional decision-making. No single mission should probably have to carry that much. And yet this one does. Perhaps that is why the phrase most dangerous space mission in 53 years resonates so strongly. Not because Artemis II is guaranteed to be more technically dangerous than every mission since Apollo. That kind of ranking is always fuzzy. Risk resists easy comparison. But because the mission concentrates so many unresolved tensions into one flight, that gives it a density of meaning and danger that feels larger than the bare mission profile alone. This is one reason the story keeps pulling us back to the heat shield. Not because the entire mission is only about that one piece of hardware, but because the heat shield is the place where all abstraction eventually becomes material. Budgets, politics, culture, leadership, engineering judgment, risk tolerance, historical memory, everything condenses into a physical interface between capsule and fire. The heat shield is where systems become truth. And in that sense, it is almost the perfect symbol for Artemis itself. A layer built from inherited material, modified for a new vehicle, used under new assumptions, tested in one way, unexpectedly damaged, defended through analysis, criticized through memory, and trusted, finally, because there is no time or consensus to do something more fundamental before the crew goes. What could better represent a modern return to the moon effort than that? Inherited ambition, modified architecture, unexpected cost, confidence under pressure, a damaged legacy patched through revised trajectory and determination. That is Artemis in miniature. And it brings us back to the question at the heart of all exploration stories, the question that appears every time human beings try to do something at the edge of their abilities. What level of uncertainty is morally permissible? This is not purely a technical question. Engineers can model risk. They can quantify probabilities, compare scenarios, estimate margins. Those estimates matter deeply. But the final decision is never purely numerical, because once human beings are on board, probability becomes ethics. A 1 in 50 chance means one thing on paper. It means another if your friend is inside the capsule, another if your parent is inside, another if you are the one strapping in, and another if you are the leader who has to decide whether the mission flies at all. That is why human spaceflight can never be reduced to the language of systems analysis alone. The numbers matter, but they are carried by human beings whose lives are not abstractions. Perhaps that is why space agencies so often speak in the language of service, purpose, and national mission. Because to ask someone to fly under uncertainty, you have to offer them a frame in which that uncertainty is not meaningless. You have to connect private risk to public meaning. Apollo offered national destiny and Cold War necessity. Artemis offers future, leadership, presence, international coalition, and the long road to a lunar base. Whether those meanings are sufficient is the open question every deep space astronaut answers personally before the public ever hears a word. And in that sense, the crew's yes is always more intimate than any press conference can convey. People often think the hardest part of missions like this is the launch. In physical terms, maybe. In psychological terms, perhaps not. The hardest part may be the quiet moment before, not the public countdown, not the cameras, not the cheering crowds, the private moment. The one in which the astronaut knows the machine is built, the mission is set, the papers are signed, the concerns have been aired, the clock is moving, and all that remains is a final inward sentence. I am going. Reid Wiseman had that moment as a father. Victor Glover had that moment as a man carrying historical weight. Christina Koch had that moment as the child from the Earthrise poster grown into the astronaut at last. Jeremy Hansen had that moment as a rookie saying yes to the largest possible version of first flight. That is what makes the mission worth, not just because it is historic, but because it contains 4 distinct acts of consent to risk under conditions where the meaning of that risk is large enough to bend history. And if Artemis II survives, the world will move on faster than most people expect. That is another hard truth of major missions. Triumph is often followed by acceleration. The moment the crew is safe, the discussion shifts to what comes next. Artemis III, the landers, the base, the South Pole, China, the next budget, the next test, the next hardware milestone. That is how large systems metabolize success. They turn it immediately into a platform for the next demand. But before that happens, before the next stage consumes the meaning of this one, it is worth stopping and staying with the mission as it is. A dangerous journey, a cramped capsule, a crew in transit, a moon still ahead, a home still behind, a nation still arguing with itself about what exploration is for, an agency still trying to prove that the road it has reopened can actually hold human beings again. That is Artemis II before history edits it, and perhaps that is the version worth remembering most, not the polished victory speech, not the inevitable retrospective, not the simplified moral, but the unfinished moment. The moment in which the future is still uncertain, the fire has not yet come, the view is still outside the window, and 4 people are still living hour by hour inside one of the hardest decisions modern exploration has made. They are still out there now, moving through the dark, the Earth behind them, the moon ahead, the old road open once more, and all the rest of us, whether we admire the mission or doubt it or fear it or long for it, are left watching the same thing and asking the same question. What happens when humanity returns to a place it has been absent from for half a century? The honest answer is that we are about to find out. D let 1 B 0 let 1 EDB, I day la D stroke O let 1 EA1, NK let 1 EBFT CU let 1 ED1, I Kung. VI letter 1 EBF, T Theo Dung K I letter 1 EC3 U US English. Voice ready, cinematic documentary. D struck letter 1 EC3 B letter 1 E1 N Gape, TH letter 1 EB3 NG, Vow B letter 1 E3 N T R letter 1 B0, letter 1 EDB, C Va Cape Ton B letter 1 ED9 script. Final continuation, closing movement. And so we arrive at the final truth of Artemis II. For all the machinery, all the politics, all the speeches, all the historical symbolism, the mission is still built on something unbearably simple. 4 human beings left Earth. They are traveling farther than any living person has ever gone, and the only way home is through fire. That is the sentence. Everything else keeps orbiting. The budgets orbit it. The engineering debates orbit it. The national ambitions orbit it. The personal stories orbit it. The moon itself, in some strange way, orbits it too. Because once you strip away all the language that institutions use to make a mission feel manageable, what remains is the oldest and hardest fact in exploration. Distance changes the meaning of survival. If something goes wrong in low Earth orbit, the crew is still close to home by cosmic standards. Rescue is still difficult, but it belongs to the realm of planning. Return can still feel immediate. The planet is still all around you, massive, near, emotionally present. At lunar distance, none of that is true. Distance becomes not merely a number, but a condition of the body, a condition of the mind, a condition of the mission itself. Every routine on board Orion is being performed under that condition. Every laugh, every checklist, every meal, every radio call, every glance through the window, they are all happening inside distance. That is why Artemis II feels so exposed. The mission does not allow us to pretend that technology has fully tamed exploration. It reminds us that for all our systems and calculations, we are still sending fragile bodies into environments that remain fundamentally indifferent to whether those bodies come home. In that sense, the mission is almost ancient. It belongs psychologically to the same family of acts as wooden ships leaving coastlines, polar expeditions disappearing into white horizons, aircraft crossing oceans before aviation became ordinary, mountaineers taking one step higher into thinner air with no guarantee of descent. The materials are modern, the electronics are modern, the language is modern. D let 1 b 0 let 1 edb, I day la d stroke o let 1 ea1, nk let 1 ebft cu let 1 ed1, I kung. Vi letter 1 ebf, t theo dung ki letter 1 ec3 u us English. Voice ready, cinematic documentary. D stroke letter 1 ec3 b letter 1 e1 n gape, th letter 1 eb3 ng, vow b letter 1 e3 n t r letter 1 b0 letter 1 edb, c vacape ton b letter 1 ed9 script. Final continuation, closing movement. And so we arrive at the final truth of Artemis II. For all the machinery, all the politics, all the speeches, all the historical symbolism, the mission is still built on something unbearably simple. 4 human beings left Earth. They are traveling farther than any living person has ever gone, and the only way home is through fire. That is the sentence. Everything else keeps orbiting. The budgets orbit it. The engineering debates orbit it. The national ambitions orbit it. The personal stories orbit it. The moon itself, in some strange way, orbits it too. Because once you strip away all the language that institutions use to make a mission feel manageable, what remains is the oldest and hardest fact in exploration. Distance changes the meaning of survival. If something goes wrong in low Earth orbit, the crew is still close to home by cosmic standards. Rescue is still difficult, but it belongs to the realm of planning. Return can still feel immediate. The planet is still all around you, massive, near, emotionally present. At lunar distance, none of that is true. Distance becomes not merely a number, but a condition of the body, a condition of the mind, a condition of the mission itself. Every routine on board Orion is being performed under that condition. Every laugh, every checklist, every meal, every radio call, every glance through the window, they are all happening inside distance. That is why Artemis II feels so exposed. The mission does not allow us to pretend that technology has fully tamed exploration. It reminds us that for all our systems and calculations, we are still sending fragile bodies into environments that remain fundamentally indifferent to whether those bodies come home. In that sense, the mission is almost ancient. It belongs psychologically to the same family of acts as wooden ships leaving coastlines, polar expeditions disappearing into white horizons, aircraft crossing oceans before aviation became ordinary, mountaineers taking one step higher into thinner air with no guarantee of descent. The materials are modern, the electronics are modern, the language is modern, but the human structure underneath it is very old. Leave safety, cross threshold, accept risk, carry hope farther than comfort can follow. That is what Artemis II is. And maybe that is why it has captured so much attention. Not simply because it is a moon mission, but because it returns us to a version of ourselves most advanced societies often try to forget. The version that still does difficult things without certainty. We like certainty. Modern life trains us to expect it. Modern institutions promise it. Modern technology encourages the illusion that enough data can transform every danger into a well-behaved process. And often that is true, Most of modern life depends on systems so reliable that their reliability has become invisible. Airliners cross oceans, surgeons stop hearts and start them again. Networks route signals across the planet in fractions of a second. Weather satellites watch storms, rovers land on Mars. We live inside layers of managed complexity, but Artemis II reminds us that there are still edges. Still places where reliability does not mean invulnerability. Still places where confidence is real but never complete. Still places where the machine can be brilliant and the outcome still not fully domesticated in advance. That is one reason the mission feels morally serious. It is not selling us an illusion of no risk. It cannot. The people closest to it know too much for that. The astronauts know, the engineers know, mission control knows, the critics know, the families know, and perhaps the most honest thing about Artemis II is that nobody inside the story seems entirely comfortable pretending otherwise. That does not mean everyone agrees, far from it. Some believe the mission is being flown exactly when it should be, under exactly the kind of disciplined uncertainty that all ambitious exploration requires. Others believe the crew is carrying too much unresolved engineering concern, too much schedule pressure, too much symbolic burden, too much institutional will disguised as confidence. Both positions are serious, both can be argued in good faith, and until the mission ends, neither can fully defeat the other. That unresolved argument is not a weakness in the story, it is the story. Because one of the hardest things adults ever have to learn about great projects is that they are almost never pure. They are rarely born from a single perfect motive. They are usually made from braided motives: vision, fear, competition, curiosity, ego, hope, bureaucracy, courage, compromise, necessity. Apollo was like that. The shuttle was like that. Artemis is like that too. The dream of exploration is rarely delivered in clean hands, and yet sometimes the result still matters deeply. That is the contradiction Artemis II asks us to sit inside. Can something be historically necessary and institutionally flawed at the same time? Can a mission be genuinely inspiring and still deserve skepticism? Can a program pursue transcendent goals through machinery built on political compromise, cost distortion, and unresolved engineering debate? Can courage and unease coexist honestly inside the same spacecraft? Yes, that is the uncomfortable answer. Yes, and perhaps maturity, both in a nation and in an audience, begins when we stop demanding that exploration stories be morally tidy before we allow them to matter. Because tidiness is not what the frontier has ever offered. The frontier offers scale, exposure, perspective, consequence, and Artemis II offers all four: scale in the distance, exposure in the heat shield and the radiation and the silence, perspective in the view of Earth and Moon, consequence in everything that will follow if the mission succeeds or fails. For the crew, all of those things are happening at once. Imagine the psychological layering of that. At one moment, you are dealing with software. At another, you are being told a leak warning was false. Then you are exercising because your body is already adapting to a world it was not built for. Then you are eating from a rehydrated packet. Then you are at the window and the Earth is so small your mind cannot properly hold it. Then you are turning away because the task timeline demands attention. Then you are trying to sleep while floating. Then you are thinking, perhaps not in words, but in some deeper emotional register, that the only way home is through a piece of hardware people argued over on the ground before you ever left. How does a human mind live inside all that? By narrowing and widening over and over again. That may be the deepest psychological rhythm of the narrow to the task, widen to the view, narrow to the checklist, widen to the meaning, narrow to the fault light, widen to the moon, Astronauts survive by mastering that rhythm. Too narrow and the mission loses its meaning. Too wide and the mission becomes psychologically unmanageable. The art is in the movement between the two. This is something the public often misses because public narratives love climax. They want the launch, the moon, the blackout, the splashdown. But for the crew, the mission is also made of transitions. Inner transitions, cognitive transitions, emotional calibrations that happen quietly and constantly as the spacecraft moves farther out and then turns home. And then comes the turn home. The turn matters more than people think. Going outward is aspiration. Turning home is responsibility. It is one thing to head toward the moon. It is another to begin the return and feel, in the structure of the mission itself, that the beautiful outward journey was only half the bargain. The moon can be looked at in wonder. Earth must be reached in one piece. That difference hardens the emotional tone. As Orion begins its return arc, every task gains a new shade. The Earth growing in the window is beautiful, yes. It is also a deadline. The closer home gets, the closer re-entry gets. The closer re-entry gets, the harder it becomes not to think about the shield, the plasma, the blackout, the parachutes, the recovery forces, the waiting families, the rooms full of people who will know nothing for 5 minutes and be forced to let physics decide. This is one reason re-entry stories always feel different from launch stories. Launch is noisy, launch is public, launch is watched. Re-entry is intimate. Even when millions know it is happening, the essential experience is hidden. The capsule appears in fire. Communications vanish. The crew is sealed away inside heat and force, invisible to everyone else. The mission becomes private again at its most decisive moment. There is something almost ceremonial about that. A crew leaves Earth in public and returns through a corridor of silence. And in that corridor, no speech helps, no symbolism helps, no coalition of nations helps. The hardware either does what it must do or it does not. That is why the heat shield has taken on such an outsized, symbolic role in the story. Not because it is the only important system, but because it is the one system that stands most nakedly between human life and total consequence. It has no charisma, no romance, no elegant exterior drama. It is not a view, it is not a rocket. It does not even operate in a way laypeople can watch and understand in real time. And yet it may be the most honest piece of the whole mission, because it asks the question modern civilization hates most: what if we do not fully know enough yet and are going anyway? That question is terrifying because it refuses the comfort of total control, but perhaps it also tells the truth about every frontier worth the name. No one ever knows enough. Not fully. The issue is not whether uncertainty exists. The issue is whether the uncertainty has been understood as honestly as possible, argued over as fiercely as necessary, and carried only when the reasons for carrying it are weighty enough. That is the standard Artemis II is being measured against. And the world, in its own way, is participating in that measurement. Engineers measure it through data and margins. Administrators measure it through timelines and outcomes. Politicians measure it through leadership and symbolism. Critics measure it through caution and historical memory. Families measure it through absence. The public measures it through trust. The crew measures it through the simple fact of being there. There is no more intimate form of measurement than embodiment. To ride the mission is to become its moral center. And perhaps that is why the crew's restraint in public matters so much. They do not speak like people in denial. They speak like professionals who understand both the significance and the exposure of where they are. There is humor, yes. Wonder, yes. Pride, yes. But underneath all of it is discipline. They know their bodies are not only crew members, they are evidence. If the mission succeeds, their survival becomes proof. If it fails, their deaths become judgment. That is a brutal burden to place on 4 people, and yet it is the burden human exploration has often placed on small crews throughout history. Perhaps this is why certain missions become more than missions. They become mirrors. They show a civilization what it is willing to risk, what it is willing to spend, what it is willing to believe, and what kind of future it is still emotionally capable of desiring. Artemis II is that kind of mirror. Look into it, and different people will see different things. Some will see courage, some will see recklessness, some will see leadership. Some will see bureaucracy, some will see the beginning of a permanent human return to deep space. Some will see a hugely expensive attempt to recreate old glory under new branding. Some will see hope, some will see warning. All of those reflections belong to the mission. And maybe that is what makes it historically powerful before its ending is even known. It already tells us something about who we are. We are still a species that can spend decades not going and then, suddenly, decide that not going has become intolerable. We are still a species that argues bitterly about cost and meaning and safety and prestige, and then lights the rocket anyway. We are still a species that can turn one image on a child's wall into a life that circles back to the moon. We are still a species that can produce a father who explains the will to his daughters and climbs aboard. We are still a species that can hold critique and wonder in the same hand, even if uneasily. And maybe that is the real significance of Artemis II, not merely that it is returning to lunar space, but that it proves the road has not closed inside us. Closed in budgets maybe, closed in politics sometimes, closed in public imagination for long stretches, yes, but not closed inside us. The desire survived. The argument survived. The fear survived. The willingness survived. That willingness may be the rarest resource of all. Fuel can be manufactured. Hardware can be redesigned. Budgets can be expanded or cut. Roadmaps can be rewritten. Programs can be reorganized. But willingness has to live in people. Without it, there is no mission, and with it, even deeply imperfect missions become possible. This does not absolve institutions, it does not excuse weak decisions. It does not make criticism disloyal or unnecessary. It simply means that willingness is the raw human element without which all the rest remains theory. At some point, someone has to get in. Victor Glover got in. Reid Wiseman got in. Christina Koch got in, Jeremy Hansen got in. That sentence sounds almost too plain for what it contains. They got in, they let the hatch close, they trusted the rocket, they trusted the shield enough. They trusted the people around them enough, they trusted themselves enough. And then Earth fell away beneath them. The mission will end one way or another, with relief, with triumph, with new doubt, with renewed urgency, with quiet data review, with public celebration, with new criticism, with all of those things braided together. But before it ends, it is worth holding onto what it is right now. A spacecraft in transit, a crew in suspension, a species watching itself try again. That last phrase may be the one that matters most. Try again, not repeat exactly, not relive Apollo, not reenact nostalgia. Try again. Try lunar flight in a new era. Try it with new institutions, new technologies, new rivalries, new firsts, new burdens. Try it under harsher scrutiny. Try it after long silence. Try it without pretending the silence never happened. Artemis II is not valuable because it proves we are the same civilization that went to the moon before. It is valuable because it asks whether, after all the decades and all the changes, we are still capable of becoming one that goes again. And perhaps the answer will not come in a speech or a slogan. Perhaps it will come in the simplest possible sequence. Plasma, silence, signal, parachutes, ocean. If the signal returns, if the parachutes bloom, if the spacecraft floats, then Artemis II will become one of those hinge missions history only fully recognizes later. Not the one that landed, not the one that built the base, but the one that made the future believable again. And if that happens, the story will expand beyond the crew immediately. It will reach into schoolrooms, aerospace firms, military planning, international treaties, landing site politics, resource arguments, commercial lander timelines, moon base architecture, and every young person who suddenly sees lunar flight as part of the living future instead of distant past. That is the scale of what hangs on one mission, not because one mission can do everything, but because some missions reopen possibility. Artemis II may be one of them. For now, though, the ending remains unwritten. The moon is still ahead in the story, the blackout is still ahead, the fire is still ahead. Somewhere between worlds, 4 people are still carrying all of that with them, the Earth behind, the moon ahead, the old silence broken. The outcome still unknown. And all of us down here, whether we admire, doubt, fear, criticize, or hope, are left with the same final image. A small capsule in a very large dark, 4 human beings inside it. And a species, after 53 years, deciding once more that the horizon